What if I told you that a seemingly harmless African cult hid an ancient secret so powerful that it was completely destroyed by a force called divine order? Yes, you heard right. A cult that not only challenged traditional religious doctrines but also harbored within itself something that could radically change everything we know about humanity's spiritual origins, the Bible, and the eternal destiny of the soul. We are talking about a story that has been silenced, a spiritual mystery that went unnoticed for centuries, hidden behind the scenes of ancestral rituals, amid sacred chants, ancient symbols, and practices dating back to times before African colonization itself. This cult, founded on a combination of ancient traditions and forbidden elements of biblical revelation, was considered so dangerous that it was eventually annihilated, not by ordinary human hands, but by a spiritual force described by witnesses as a true intervention from heaven, a divine order, as if the invisible world itself had said, "Enough." To understand how an African spirit could be simultaneously condemned by the Bible and seen as a guide to paradise, we must go back in time, long before religious interpretations dominated the spiritual narrative. In African spiritual tradition, there are entities known as spirit guides, beings who operate between the earthly plane and the divine. These guides are not gods, but neither are they human. They occupy a position of spiritual authority, carrying with them ancestral wisdom, divine protection, and the mission to guide souls on their journey on earth. These spirits, in many African cultures, are elevated ancestors, messengers of greater deities, or personified cosmic forces. Their names vary. In some denominations, they are called orishas. In others, vodans, loas, and kisis. But regardless of the name, their spiritual function is clear. They connect the visible with the invisible, the human world with the sacred. They are guardians, protectors, pathfinders, masters of the elements, and above all, representatives of a power that existed long before modern religious structures. However, throughout history, especially during the colonization and forced Christianization of Africa, these spirits were quickly associated with evil. The colonizers, upon coming into contact with a rich, organic spirituality connected to nature and invisible forces, failed to understand it, and more than that, they feared its power. After all, what cannot be controlled is condemned. Thus, what was once a guiding light became labeled a demon. What was wisdom became witchcraft, and what was ancestral became heresy. That was the first mistake, confusing the unknown with the evil. And this is precisely where the central point of today's video comes in. Because the African spirit we are investigating has been placed in this limbo, its essence has been stripped away, its spiritual function erased, and its image completely distorted. In the tradition from which it comes, it is revered, invoked with respect, consulted in times of crisis, and invoked for protection. But in traditional theology, it has been condemned to hell, without the right to a defense. Now you might be wondering, but isn't the Bible clear about prohibiting contact with spirits? Indeed, there are passages that address necromancy, divination, and spiritual practices. In Deuteronomy 18:10-12, for example, there is a direct condemnation of anyone who consults the dead, practices enchantments, or serves as a medium. And therein lies the conflict. The Bible, when read literally, seems to reject any spiritual contact that doesn't come directly from God. But do these passages refer to the same guides venerated in ancient cultures? Or are we applying mistaken interpretations to completely different contexts? It is important to understand that African spirituality does not practice invoking the dead in the pejorative sense that has been attributed to it. What is practiced is communication with the sacred through beings that already exist between worlds, beings that are not bound by time or space, beings that, in many cultures, are seen as servants of the Creator God Himself, the one who is above all and everyone. Yes, for many African traditions, including those that have been syncretized with Christianity, these spirits are not rivals of God, but expressions of His will. But how can we explain this to a doctrine that has already determined what is light and what is darkness, with no room for nuance? This is the root of the clash between tradition and religion, a clash that is not only theological but also historical, political, and social. The Bible was shaped by men over centuries with different cultural influences, power interests, and spiritual agendas. Many traditions were simply erased, labeled heresy. And within this context, African spiritual practices, with all their complexity, were labeled simplistically and condemningly. And this created an even bigger problem. Millions of people began to reject their own spiritual roots, believing they were serving God, when in fact they were just reproducing a colonized vision of faith. But what if the Bible, or rather the men who interpreted the Bible, erred in this judgment? What if the spirit that was condemned was actually a servant of light, a divine messenger with a mission to guide lost souls? What if this spirit is precisely what is missing in the understanding of many Christians who feel disconnected from spirituality, even within the religion? Isn't it time to revisit the scriptures with cleaner, less indoctrinated, freer eyes? Christ himself, on many occasions, contradicted the religious leaders of his time. He spoke to those forbidden, healed on the Sabbath, and forgave what the law declared unforgivable. Jesus did not follow human rules but the will of the Father, and this will often manifest itself in ways the system cannot control. Perhaps if we look closely, we will see that there is much more legitimate spirituality among marginalized peoples and traditions than in the gilded palaces of established religions. By denying the African spirit and all it represents, perhaps we have closed a sacred door, a door that once led to paradise. Because if it is indeed a guide, then to reject it is to reject the very root that leads to the divine. That's why it's so important to reflect deeply on this topic, because it doesn't just concern a spiritual entity, but how we relate to the sacred, the invisible, the eternal. Is our faith based on genuine revelation? Or are we simply repeating inherited convictions without ever questioning them? And what's more, is true spirituality, the kind that transforms, guides, and liberates, really where we've been told it would be? Or is it hidden precisely in what we've been taught to fear? Now I want to hear from you. What we're discussing here is too profound to ignore. Comment below. Do you believe African spiritual guides can be sent by God? Or do you still carry the weight of religious condemnation on this topic? And if you've made it this far, it's because something within you is being awakened. So don't forget to like it. This simple gesture will help this video reach more people like you who seek real, not just figurative spirituality. And of course, if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, now is the time. Here we discuss hidden mysteries, hidden truths, biblical revelations, and wisdom that transcends time. Hit the bell, because what follows will take you even deeper into this mystery and perhaps finally reveal who this African spirit truly was, one condemned by the Bible, but recognized by heaven as a guide. Let's continue. But what, after all, was this cult hiding? Why did he become such a threat that he was erased from official history? And most disturbingly, why was the evidence that could prove the existence of this secret deliberately removed, burned, or sealed in inaccessible archives? In this video, we'll delve deep into this hidden enigma of African spiritual history, a story many would rather you never know. Revelations connect forgotten passages of the Bible, apocryphal books, missionary accounts, and mystical symbols found in caves and sacred ruins in the heart of Africa. Prepare to understand how this sect was created, what its true beliefs were, and why scholars of the faith believe it carried information that directly challenged the traditional narratives of modern Christianity. And most impressively, records show that there were prophecies related to the destiny of humanity, visions of spiritual wars, and a hidden code that, according to them, had been revealed by celestial beings. Now, you might be wondering, why haven't you heard about this? The answer is as baffling as the mystery itself. Over time, any trace of this cult was systematically erased, not only by governments and religious leaders, but, according to some scholars, by a spiritual force that prevented this forbidden knowledge from continuing to be disseminated. And this is where the most disturbing point of this story comes in. The so-called divine order was not just a metaphor. It was reported as a sequence of supernatural events that culminated in the immediate and irreversible extinction of the cult, with sudden deaths, physical collapses of temples, and the disappearance of sacred texts under unexplained circumstances. But what exactly was contained in these texts? What teachings were so dangerous that they would justify direct action by spiritual forces? And why, even today, do those who try to bring these stories to light end up being discredited, silenced, or disappearing? In this video, you'll discover how this cult formed, what it knew about the origin of the human soul, and why its prophecies, if true, may contain forgotten spiritual keys capable of freeing or imprisoning the soul of those who know them. Let's analyze the details that history tried to bury, compare them with biblical revelations, and seek to understand why the divine order acted with such severity. But before revealing what was found and what secrets were destroyed along with the cult, you need to know what was behind it all, because what comes next could shake your faith or strengthen it like never before. So, before we continue with the deeper revelations about this cult destroyed by the so-called divine order, I want to ask you something very important. If this content has impacted you in any way, if it made you reflect on what lies hidden between the lines of humanity's spiritual history, please leave a like right now. This shows YouTube that this type of investigation needs to reach more people like you, people who aren't content with the obvious, who seek truth beyond what they've been taught. And tell me here in the comments, have you ever heard of cults that involve spiritual forces so intense that they are supernaturally destroyed? Do you believe that certain knowledge is actually forbidden by God, or just censored by men? I read every comment, and many of the upcoming videos emerge precisely from the questions and insights you leave below. So, your participation is essential. And of course, if you're not already subscribed to the channel, this is the perfect time to join our community. Here we unearth hidden truths, analyze the mysteries of the Bible, and connect you with the deepest side of spirituality. Also, activate the bell so you don't miss the next episodes, because what comes next in this video will shake up everything you thought you knew. Now then, let's continue. To understand the depth of this story and the true impact of what happened, we need to go back in time and delve into the historical and spiritual context of this African cult. A cult that, although seemingly located in an isolated region of the continent, had ramifications that transcended tribal, geographic, and spiritual boundaries. It originated in the heart of West Africa, in a region where oral traditions were the basis of ancestral wisdom and where the spiritual intertwined with everyday life. There, entire peoples lived in harmony with rites that invoked not only the spirits of their ancestors, but also entities that, according to them, came from higher dimensions. And it is precisely at this point that things begin to take an unexpected turn. This cult was not just any mystical group. It was built on profound spiritual pillars, intertwined with ancient concepts that connected almost mysteriously with narratives found in biblical texts, especially those that were not canonized, such as the Book of Enoch, the Apocalypse of Moses, and other sources considered apocryphal. Its leaders claimed to possess direct knowledge, revealed by higher spiritual entities, about the origin of the human soul, the purpose of creation, and the invisible battle between the forces of light and darkness. Naturally, upon encountering such claims, most religious authorities, both local and foreign, considered the cult heretical, dangerous, and even demonic. But what really lay behind such revulsion? According to records discovered later, the rituals performed by this cult included invocations, chants in forgotten languages, and the use of symbols that also appear, in veiled forms, in esoteric Jewish and Christian traditions. There is evidence that many of these spiritual elements were transmitted by ancient priests who fled religious persecution in the Middle East and eventually found refuge in African communities. Over the centuries, these practices merged with animistic beliefs, forming a hybrid spirituality, powerful, complex, and highly symbolic. The most controversial aspect of all this, however, wasn't the syncretism. It was the content of the messages received in trance by some cult leaders. These messages spoke of an invisible war that would intensify at the end of time. They mentioned a supreme entity who was about to restore the truth about human creation, revealing that part of history had been intentionally erased by forces intent on keeping humanity trapped in spiritual ignorance. And it was at this point that the narrative of the divine order began to emerge. The idea of a divine order originates from various spiritual schools of thought, some Christian, others Hermetic or Gnostic. It carries the notion that, at critical moments in history, when spiritual corruption reaches a certain level, God, or celestial entities under his command, intervene directly in human reality to restore order, eliminate deception, and preserve those who still maintain genuine faith. In some more rigid doctrinal lines, this intervention can occur in extreme forms, with catastrophes, collapses of civilizations, and even the destruction of entire communities considered sources of perversion or heresy. In others, this order manifests as a subtle, almost invisible adjustment, in the spiritual structures that govern the earthly plane. In the case of this cult, the manifestations that followed its final rituals were so intense and unusual that local elders and even Christian leaders began to attribute them to the action of a higher spiritual force, a sort of sacred execution. Reports speak of phenomena that defy logic: sounds coming from the sky in strange languages, intense lights appearing at night in the middle of the forests where secret meetings took place, priests who suddenly and irreversibly lost their speech after invoking certain names during chants, temples collapsing without any physical impact, manuscripts that simply disappeared from locked places. For many, this was a clear sign that the heavens had judged and executed a sentence. A divine order had been decreed. The cult was to cease to exist. Its secrets were no longer to be shared. Its revelations, fascinating as they were crossing dangerous boundaries, opening spiritual doors that could compromise not only the faith of many, but also the balance between the visible and invisible worlds. But why all this now? Why are these stories only now beginning to emerge with greater force? The answer may lie in the prophetic times we live in. If you've studied biblical prophecies, such as those in Revelation, Daniel, or even lesser-known books, you know that many signs point to an intensification of the spiritual battle in the final days. And precisely in these times, hidden truths begin to surface. The veil separating the sacred from the profane grows thinner. That's why stories like this, despite having been suppressed for so long, resonate powerfully again. It's not just a historical issue, it's spiritual. We're talking about knowledge that, according to some schools of thought, could liberate multitudes, but which, if used out of context, could also bring confusion and deception. This is the danger of accessing higher truths without spiritual maturity. Perhaps that's why the so-called divine order was so severe. Perhaps it was, in fact, a kind of mercy, an act of restraint, a protective barrier to prevent powerful truths from falling into the wrong hands. But was that really the case? Or was the destruction of this cult just another chapter in the long history of spiritual censorship? Could we be witnessing an attempt to conceal something that, if revealed, would completely collapse the very fabric of institutional religion? We don't yet have all the answers, but what we've discovered so far is enough to shake many certainties. And that's why I want to know from you. What do you think of all this so far? Do you believe that God can intervene directly when something threatens the spiritual plane? Or is this so-called divine order actually a nice name given by authorities to justify extreme actions and control knowledge? Leave your thoughts in the comments, including the phrase, "The veil is falling," if you believe we are living in a time of profound spiritual revelation. And of course, we'll continue soon, because what comes next will further shake the foundations of your spiritual perception. The history of this cult didn't begin as a threat. On the contrary, it originated among a people thirsting for deeper spiritual revelations, people who were not content with superficial rituals or the institutional religion imposed by Western colonizers or missionaries. According to records preserved by generations of storytellers, the so-called spiritual griots, this cult arose from a series of visions shared by different tribes in regions separated by hundreds of kilometers. The visions were too similar to be coincidence. An entity of light, human in appearance but with eyes like fire, revealed the existence of heavenly books that had been denied to humanity. And along with these revelations, a calling to restore true knowledge of the heavens before it was too late. These tribes, each with their own spiritual tradition, began meeting secretly, sending representatives to hidden gatherings in the mountains and dense forests. What formed there wasn't just a cult, it was an alliance, a spiritual brotherhood united by a single mission, to piece together what they called the fragmented revelation. Their leaders argued that the Bible, as we know it today, was only a partial reflection of the truth, as many of the original texts had been lost, banned, or distorted over time. Therefore, this cult began to seek these hidden truths, connecting fragments of texts, oral traditions, and symbols scattered across various ancient cultures. One of the most fascinating and disturbing aspects of this story is that the cult's central teachings seem to anticipate, centuries in advance, events described in biblical passages. Their secret texts spoke of a global spiritual rupture, a kind of fall of doctrines, and the emergence of a new form of spirituality, purer, more intimate, more connected to the essence of the Creator. They also spoke of a spiritual seed that had been planted in Africa, destined to awaken in due time. It wasn't about a new religion, but about restoring what had been hidden since ancient times. That's why, for the initiated, this cult was not only respected, it was revered as the bearer of a divine mission. But for outsiders, especially those with more orthodox religious views, the cult seemed dangerous. Its practices involved symbols easily associated with witchcraft or the occult. Its chants, sung in unknown languages, sounded like invocations. And its teachings about multiple heavens, guardian spirits, and numerical codes in the scriptures frightened even the most liberal scholars. The cult's members believed they were in direct contact with the angels who remained faithful, a reference to celestial beings they believed were sent to earth not only to observe, but also to prepare the chosen for a new era. This concept directly echoes what we find in the Book of Enoch, a text excluded from most modern Bibles, but which contains profound revelations about the Watchers, angels who interacted with humans in ancient times. Interestingly, some of the content circulating within the cult referenced an ancient African prophecy, passed down from generation to generation, which stated that, when the rivers bleed and the winds speak with fire, the truth will be destroyed before it can be revealed. Many believe this prophecy foretold the cult's abrupt end, before its full knowledge could come to light. And indeed, several strange weather phenomena were reported in the days leading up to the destruction of the central temple, which for members was confirmation that the prophetic time had arrived. Most strikingly, several of the cult's rituals were structured similarly to biblical festivals mentioned in the Old Testament, such as Yom Kippur and the Feast of Tabernacles, but with adaptations based on revelations received in visions. They celebrated time, lunar and solar cycles, and claimed that the divine calendar had been altered by men, distancing humanity from true communion with God. This practice caused revulsion in local churches, which viewed it all as idolatry and heresy. But was it really idolatry? Or were they, in some way, trying to reclaim a purer spiritual connection, lost over the ages? This question echoes to this day. The cult elders claimed there was a hidden code in the scriptures, not a common esoteric code, but a vocal code, where certain words and sounds, when chanted correctly, activated specific spiritual dimensions. They taught that the Bible was like a map, but that only with the right vocal key could spiritual portals be accessed. And this is what they did in their most secret rituals. They chanted these words in unison, with fasting and consecration, to access parallel realities where they received instructions for their next steps. According to accounts from former members, these moments were marked by collective visions, a sensation of levitation, and even angelic apparitions. All of this, of course, is impossible to prove scientifically, but the reports are too consistent and repetitive to be ignored. It's at this point that the story begins to take an even darker turn. As the cult grew, tensions grew between them and local religious leaders. Churches began to openly preach against them, calling them a demonic sect. Investigative missions were organized by spiritual authorities to try to understand what was happening there. And it was during this period of growing tension that the first signs of collapse began to appear. But before we delve into the events that marked the end, I want you to think with me. What's so dangerous about a group seeking deeper answers about God and the spiritual realm? Why is it that whenever someone tries to go beyond what's written between the lines of the Bible, they end up persecuted, silenced, or even eliminated? History seems to repeat itself, generation after generation. Is this simply religious fanaticism, or are we talking about a spiritual resistance far greater than we imagine? Now tell me, have you ever heard of African prophecies that connect with the end of times? Or do you believe that these revelations are just human interpretations? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and if you've been following along closely so far, write the phrase, "The fragmented truth is coming back," in the comments, just so I know you're part of the minority who are truly awake to all this. And hold on tight, because what comes next is even more revealing. Tension between the cult's followers and local spiritual and political authorities increased month by month. The cult grew discreetly but steadily. Its rituals spread to regions where access to information was limited, and at the same time, reports of miraculous healings, spiritual liberations, and visions of celestial beings emerged during ceremonies. This, of course, aroused even more distrust. But what truly changed everything The trigger for the collapse came from within, from someone who, until then, had been part of the group's most closed-off core, a man who, by all accounts, was extremely respected, almost considered a prophet by the other members. No one imagined that he would become the key player in the exposé that would change everything. His real name was never revealed, but he became known as He Who Tore the Veil. He appeared unexpectedly at a small Christian community in the region during a prayer service, claiming to be carrying a spiritual burden he urgently needed to share. According to witnesses, he was visibly shaken, like someone who had witnessed something beyond the limits of what was bearable. At first, they thought he was simply disturbed, perhaps even spiritually possessed. But then he began to recount, in terrifying detail, everything he witnessed behind the scenes of the service. He revealed that, behind its mystical and seemingly harmless exterior, the cult performed secret rituals involving extremely ancient spiritual codes, symbols that, he claimed, were directly connected to what Revelation calls the doctrines of the fallen angels. He said certain cult leaders knew this but hid this part of their teachings from most members, claiming that such knowledge was merely symbolic language that needed to be deciphered with spiritual maturity. But this man saw more than that. He said that during one of the most advanced rituals, performed in complete secrecy, he witnessed an invocation that did not seem to be in harmony with the kingdom of God. The sounds, the vibration in the room, the atmosphere of sudden darkness, everything indicated that something had been awakened, and it was not something holy, and that wasn't all. He explained that there was a secret room hidden behind the main altar where ancient manuscripts were kept, wrapped in red cloths and protected by symbols he would only identify later when he sought help from pastors and Bible scholars. These symbols matched occult records found in apocryphal books related to ancient magic and rituals of communication with entities from other spiritual spheres. He also saw drawings of structures that strongly resembled the cherubim described in the book of Ezekiel, but with deformed features. Winged creatures with eyes all over their bodies, carrying spiral-shaped objects, accompanied by phrases in languages that seemed to blend Hebrew, Aramaic, and extinct African dialects. In recounting all this, he wasn't seeking fame or attention. On the contrary, he claimed to have disobeyed a spiritual order by leaving the cult, for all initiates knew that once they left, they would carry a curse, and he was already experiencing the symptoms: recurring nightmares, shadows that followed him, temporary memory loss, and lapses in consciousness. Still, he said he'd rather pay the price than continue to watch the lie spread. Following this complaint, religious leaders in the region began investigating. First discreetly, then with direct confrontations. Some more traditional churches sent emissaries to the site where the rituals took place. What they found there shocked them deeply. The cult's central temple, which from the outside looked like a common meditation space, hid, underground, a small subterranean complex with circular rooms, walls covered in inscriptions, and objects they had never seen before. Some visitors said that, upon entering the place, they felt such a spiritual weight that they were sick for days. There were books there, very ancient, handwritten books with leather covers marked with strange coats of arms. One of them had a title that translated something like, "The Words Not to Be Spoken Aloud." Another seemed to contain instructions for spiritual journeys through specific dimensional layers, using only vocal intonations and sound frequencies. The religious authorities who had access to these were alarmed, not only because of the content, but because some of the things described in these texts matched descriptions found in prophetic visions of Christian saints, and even in the book of Daniel itself. This sparked panic, and the fear wasn't just about what was happening, but about what could happen if it spread. Pastors, priests, and spiritual leaders began publicly warning their communities, saying that a heretical and occult movement was growing. Soon, the cult, once seen as a spiritual curiosity, became the direct target of accusations of witchcraft, necromancy, and idolatry of fallen entities. Even without formal proof of demonic rituals, the mere act of guarding forbidden symbols and books that contradicted the official biblical narrative was enough to decree its end. And that's when the notion of divine order returned with a vengeance. Many began to say that God had allowed one of the members to betray the secret not by chance, but as part of a direct action from heaven to prevent the cult from fulfilling an evil purpose. Others said the denunciation was just the beginning of the spiritual cleansing to come, and indeed, in the days following the denunciation, strange things began to happen. reports emerged of phenomena that could not be rationally explained. Structural collapses without apparent cause, extremely strong winds on calm nights, spontaneous fires on altars, and the sudden death of two of the cult's oldest leaders. All of this was interpreted as confirmation that God had personally intervened, as he had done before in biblical history, such as the fall of Jericho, the destruction of Sodom, and the deaths of Ananias and Sapphira. For the faithful, it was a clear sign. It wasn't just one group being destroyed. It was a spiritual correction taking place before everyone's eyes. But what if that wasn't quite the case? What if the denunciation wasn't guided by God but by fear? What if the book's contents were, in fact, dangerous, not because they were evil, but because they revealed something many prefer to keep hidden? This is the question that lingers to this day. Because until now, the full content of these manuscripts has never been revealed, and the few fragments that have survived have been classified by scholars as highly sensitive material. So now I want to know from you, do you think it was really God who acted there? Or was it man trying to silence something he didn't understand? Write the phrase, "Not everything that is hidden is evil," in the comments, if you believe that there are spiritual truths that have been hidden for convenience, not for holiness. And get ready, because what comes next will reveal details that few people have dared to reveal until now. After the denunciation and the events that followed, the collapse of the cult seemed inevitable. But what no one expected was that everything would spill out of that community and cross borders with such force. When the first images from the site began to circulate, short cell phone videos showing the destruction of the temples, the symbols carved into the walls, and fragments of the manuscripts, the news spread quickly. What began as a local scandal soon turned into a global avalanche. Within weeks, journalists from around the world began investigating the case. But what was even more shocking was the way the events were handled by different sectors of society. While some media outlets presented the story as an unusual archaeological and spiritual discovery, others treated the case with a tone of alarm, suggesting that we might be facing a new apocalyptic cult masquerading as a spiritual movement. Debates took over online forums, podcasts, and spirituality and theology channels. What was once a mystery confined to that small part of Africa now gained the status of a global phenomenon. And when that happens, the truth begins to be disputed. The Christian community reacted in force. Traditional churches organized events and prayer vigils declaring spiritual war against what they called a resurgence of apostasy disguised as wisdom. Pastors warned their faithful about the dangers of unbiblical doctrines, stating that Satan often disguises himself as an angel of light to deceive even the elect. Videos began to circulate with excerpts from the manuscripts found at the service, interpreted as dangerous heresies and distortions of God's word. The order was clear. This could not be true. It had to be combated. But not everyone was convinced it was something evil. Biblical scholars from various fields began analyzing the fragments of the revealed texts. Some recognized elements common to ancient books such as the Book of Jubilees, the Testament of Solomon, and even the Dead Sea Scrolls. What was surprising was that, although the contents were controversial, many of them bore legitimate connections to events mentioned in the Bible, not as copies, but as complementary pieces of a much larger puzzle. This possibility sparked a new line of thought among researchers. What if, rather than a heretical sect, this cult was actually in possession of fragments of a spiritual truth that had been erased from history? Theories began to multiply. Some independent theologians suggested that we were dealing with a forgotten truth, a body of spiritual teachings deliberately omitted from religious councils over the centuries. Others claimed that the cult had accessed ancient spiritual knowledge dating back to the pre-flood era, the time when God's sons came to earth, as described in Genesis 6. The boldest hypothesis claimed that some of the manuscripts contained prophecies not revealed even to the prophet John in Revelation, and that God had reserved this knowledge for the end times. At that point, the internet exploded. Spiritual influencers from different walks of life began producing content about the cult, the forbidden texts, and the signs that had preceded the group's downfall. Searches for terms like divine order, lost manuscripts, African prophecies, and hidden truths of the Bible soared on search engines. For some, it was all pure spiritual manipulation. For others, divine intervention. But for many, and perhaps most of the silent observers, the only question remaining, what else is hidden from us? And the most curious thing is that, In the face of this collective doubt, a new spiritual perception began to emerge in some people, an intense thirst to understand spirituality more deeply, without the constraints of institutional doctrines, without the fear of being labeled a heretic simply for asking questions. Study groups began to form, seeking to understand the symbolic patterns of the published texts. Some communities began to incorporate certain cult practices, such as fasting in silence, prayers in unknown tongues, and harmonious chanting, believing that, although the cult had been lost, something true remained. And herein lies the danger, or the opportunity. The secular media, in turn, treated the case as yet another bizarre phenomenon originating from Africa, without giving due attention to its spiritual aspect. Newspapers and magazines published articles with titles like "The Sect of Forbidden Books" or "Secret Rituals in the Heart of the Forest," always reinforcing the idea of tribal mysticism, completely disregarding the deep connections with biblical themes. This sparked outrage among serious scholars, who began to denounce an attempt to delegitimize the content of the texts and divert focus from what really mattered, the content of the revelations. And among all these voices, religious leaders, academics, mainstream media, influencers, a new group has emerged, the Truth Rebuilders, people who believe the cult's fall was not the end, but the beginning of a process of restoration. This group argues that we are experiencing the beginning of the fulfillment of a silent prophecy, the progressive revelation of what was sealed in the last days. For them, the cult's emergence, its destruction, and the partial release of its texts are just the first seals being broken, and what comes next is something that will shake the entire structure of organized faith. Many of these reconstructionists are writing their own analyses, connecting the revealed texts with biblical prophecies, especially those concerning the sealed book mentioned in Daniel and Revelation. They are convinced that, just as John could not write down everything he saw, many texts were also kept from the eyes of the people until the right time arrived, and now, perhaps, that time is beginning to be fulfilled. But, of course, this view is highly contested by traditional theologians who consider any text outside the biblical canon to be dangerous, heretical, or misleading. Even so, the repercussions were so great that even universities began to debate the case. Courses on Christian mysticism, African spiritual traditions, and apocryphal texts attracted new students, interested in better understanding what really happened. The cult itself may have been destroyed, but the seed of spiritual curiosity was planted in the hearts of thousands of people around the world. And as we know, when the thirst for truth spreads, no wall can hold it back. Now let me ask you, what is your opinion on all this? Do you believe that we are facing yet another modern heresy or a truth that has been forgotten, perhaps even hidden by the religious structure itself? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if you've been following along this far, comment, "The truth is coming out of hiding," so I know you're paying attention and are awake. We'll keep going because what follows delves even deeper into the mystery this cult held. And you need to know this. The most enigmatic moment in this entire story was, without a doubt, the moment the cult ceased to be merely a theological threat or a spiritual curiosity and became the direct target of a coordinated action that, to this day, few can clearly explain. The intervention that occurred became known among those who closely followed it as the Divine Order. But what exactly was this order? Who carried it out? And most importantly, did it truly come from God, or was it a human action masked by sacred language to justify a spiritual attack? It all began with a hastily convened meeting of religious leaders from various denominations. Pastors, bishops, traditional priests, and even conservative biblical scholars were present. The spiritual tension that had lingered over the region since the allegations had become unbearable. Strange manifestations began to be reported frequently. Reports of apparitions during Christian services, voices whispering biblical verses in ancient languages, objects moving by themselves in houses where cult members had passed. Fear spread, not because of what was known, but because of what was still hidden. It was then that a small group of spiritual leaders volunteered to enter enemy territory, as they called themselves, to carry out a spiritual cleansing operation. They called themselves guardians of sound doctrine and claimed to be acting under direct guidance from the Holy Spirit. According to testimonies, this decision was not made solely out of fear or human impulses. Those involved claimed to have received clear spiritual signs that the region had become a nest of darkness in urgent need of purification. And it was from this conviction that the action known as divine order was born. This intervention was neither military nor governmental. There was no involvement from the state or any police force. It was, according to those involved, a purely spiritual mission, planned through intense prayer and fasting. They prepared for 7 days in absolute silence, fasting for long periods and consecrating themselves, as in Old Testament times. Before leaving, they gathered the community and asked for spiritual protection. They claimed they would enter the territory not with physical weapons, but with spiritual weapons: prayer, praise, psalms, anointing with oil, and prophetic decrees. Their entry into the place of worship was described as a true clash of kingdoms. What happened next became legend for some and prophetic confirmation for others. The moment the group stepped into the temple where the manuscripts had been stored, a sudden gust of wind swept through the place. Trees bent, animals fled, and a sound reminiscent of dry thunder echoed from within the building. Some of those present fell to the ground, others were paralyzed. Testimonies describe a heavy spiritual presence taking over the room, followed by absolute silence as if time had stopped. Not a word was spoken. Everyone remained motionless for about 2 minutes until, according to reports, one of the group's leaders raised his hand and began to pray aloud, reciting biblical passages from the books of Psalms and Isaiah. It was at that moment that the ground shook. It wasn't an ordinary earthquake. It was a localized one, as if only that temple was being shaken by an invisible force. The walls began to crack, the ceiling creaked violently, and within minutes, part of the structure collapsed. The group rushed outside, watching part of the temple collapse. But what caught their attention most wasn't the physical destruction. It was what happened in the following minutes. A strong smell of incense, which wasn't part of Christian worship, nor had it ever been used by them, permeated the air, and with it, a thick fog making vision difficult. Several members of the group reported seeing glowing figures walking among the rubble, human figures, but with supernatural features, eyes like embers, robes that fluttered slightly, and an expression of pain. Yes, pain, not hatred, not fury, but pain. This manifestation divided opinions. For some, it was the presence of angels sent to destroy that which God had disapproved. For others, it was the spirit of those who guarded the hidden teachings, trying to protect the final fragments of a truth that was about to be lost forever. The fact is that everything changed after that day. The temple was closed. The manuscripts, or what remained of them, were removed from the site and taken to an unknown destination. The group that participated in the intervention underwent spiritual experiences so intense that many of them were never the same again. Some began to have recurring dreams with the same symbols found in the texts. Others lost their appetite, fell ill without apparent medical cause, or developed spiritual gifts they had never manifested before. And that's when theories exploded again. After all, who or what really acted there? Was the so-called divine order truly an intervention from heaven, or a spiritual ritual of confrontation that opened portals that should never have been touched? Was there something sacred in that place? Or was it just another spiritual trap disguised as light? Some scholars began to meticulously analyze every detail of what the participants said, comparing it with biblical passages that speak of sudden judgments and angelic interventions. Biblical linguistics experts also pored over the accounts of the words spoken during the phenomenon, trying to find clues in ancient languages like primitive Hebrew and sacred Aramaic. And it was then that a curious pattern emerged. One of the words chanted repeatedly by one of the leaders during the collapse was Rav Kadosh, which can be translated as Great Holy One, or He who sanctifies with justice. This expression appears in ancient texts related to spiritual judgments. It's as if that word were a key, a spiritual password, that when released in the right environment, under the right atmosphere, provoked immediate divine intervention. Others suggest that the use of this word may have activated spiritual realities that had been sealed for centuries. The truth is that there is still no consensus. What is known for certain is that after this episode, the site was abandoned. No rituals were performed again. Access roads became impassable. Vegetation grew abnormally. And local residents claimed that the area became spiritually dead, without voices, without presences, without signs, as if it had been sealed, as if a sentence had been carried out. And now that you know this side of the story, I want to know from you, Do you believe that God really intervenes in such a direct and intense way? Or was it a human action covered in religiosity? Write your thoughts in the comments. And if you've made it this far, write the phrase, "When God acts, no one can stop him." So I know you're committed to this journey. In the next few minutes, we'll continue and delve even deeper, because what was hidden from that temple is perhaps more revealing than anything we've seen so far. After what was described as a manifestation of divine order, not only the temple's rubble was buried, but also information, evidence, fragments, and documents that could shed light on the true content of that cult. The weeks that followed the intervention were marked by an unusual silence. Not a natural silence, but something heavy, dense, almost spiritual. The few people who dared approach the site found everything devastated. The previously open paths were covered by mud. Vegetation took over in a matter of days, and the last visible traces of the cult were covered, as if nature itself had been ordered to erase the memory of that place. But what few know, or rather, what few have the courage to tell, is that before the final destruction, some documents were hastily removed from the site. There was a gap of hours between the spiritual collapse of the site and the definitive disappearance of all items connected to the cult. Sources close to the group that led the action revealed, anonymously, that at least 3 sealed boxes were taken by human hands, not supernatural forces. These boxes contained not only manuscripts, but also sacred artifacts, objects used in rituals, possibly with inscriptions referring to ancient languages, mystical symbols, and handwritten records with codes and spiritual maps. The contents of these boxes have never been released. No religious authority has officially commented on their whereabouts. And this is where the mystery deepens. Why did these documents disappear? Why weren't they presented to the theological community for study, comparison, and analysis? Why wasn't there even a public mention of the existence of these records? The answer may seem frightening, but it's simple. Spiritual censorship. Someone, or some group, decided that they couldn't be shared with the public. And this brings us to a question many avoid asking out loud. Who has an interest in keeping these revelations hidden? Throughout history, whenever something spiritual threatens the power structure, whether religious, political, or cultural, there is an effort to silence, erase, distort, or ridicule the source of revelation. It was no different with the apostles. It was no different with the prophets. It was no different with Christ himself. Why would it be any different now? Think about it. We're talking about texts that, according to those with partial access to them, offered completely different interpretations of fundamental themes of faith: the origin of humankind, the mission of angels on earth, the spiritual cycles of time, and even the true meaning of Lucifer's fall. One of the documents, according to reports from those who read it for a few minutes before it was confiscated, spoke of a temple of light that was thrown down before the creation of the visible world. This type of narrative doesn't fit the mold of classical theology, but it appears in veiled forms in passages such as Isaiah 14, Ezekiel 28, and even in Job chapter 38, where God asks Job, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth?" This type of content, if disseminated without filters, could generate a crisis of faith in many people, and at the same time, it could awaken a multitude trapped in empty, repetitive religious structures devoid of living revelation. That's why, for many leaders, the best strategy was to silence everything, to protect the church from chaos. But is this really protection or control? Unofficial reports circulating among independent scholars speak of the existence of artifacts with inscriptions similar to those found in Qumran, in the caves where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. One of the texts mentioned a cycle of 49 moons, which would correspond to a prophetic time when sealed truths would begin to emerge, but would be immediately stifled by those who guard the gates of knowledge. The expression gatekeepers appears in some apocryphal texts related to the Enochian tradition, referring to spiritual beings tasked with protecting access to certain layers of truth. If this is true, then we have before us a case not only of physical concealment of documents, but of planned spiritual censorship. Someone, or something, decided that the time had not yet come, or worse, that the time should never come. But how can we silence something that has already been partially released? How can we prevent the seeds of truth from blossoming in the minds and hearts of those who are awakening spiritually, even without the full texts? The answer may lie in manipulating the narrative. If you can't erase something's existence, the next strategy is to discredit it. This is what happened soon after the documents disappeared. Reports emerged claiming it was all a legend, that the texts found were forgeries created by mystical groups, that the artifacts had been removed from museums and reintroduced into the cult to stir up trouble. But none of these accusations were proven, and yet the cult's image went from spiritual mystery to doctrinal threat. The narrative was manipulated, the truth was tarnished, and most people simply accepted it. But there's an even deeper layer to all this. Some key words found in fragments of the rescued texts point to connections with biblical passages rarely mentioned in traditional sermons. One example is Psalm 82, which says, "God stands in the assembly of the gods. He judges in the midst of the gods." This passage, often ignored or superficially explained, raises the possibility of a more complex spiritual hierarchy than we've been taught. And precisely these higher spiritual levels, also mentioned in Colossians 1:16 as thrones, dominions, principalities, and powers, would be present in the cult's teachings. But with one detail: the cult claimed that some of these entities today operate not only in the spiritual world but also through human institutions. This, if true, would completely change the way we view spiritual warfare. We wouldn't just be dealing with individual demonic attacks, but with entire systems influenced by much older and more organized spiritual intelligences. This would be one of the reasons the texts needed to be hidden, because exposing these truths would mean shining a light in places where it has never been allowed to shine. And that's when we understand why so much effort was put into burying everything, both physically and spiritually. But now, with fragments leaking, with testimonies spreading, with people remembering what they saw, heard, and felt, there's no going back. The box has been opened, the seal has been broken, and no matter how hard they try to hide it, seeds have already been planted in the minds of those who are paying attention, those who sense there's more than what the pulpit preaches, those who know that revelation is progressive, living, and that God has never stopped speaking. Now tell me, do you believe that certain texts were intentionally hidden from the Bible? What part of the truth was sealed so as not to awaken the wrong generation? Leave your opinion in the comments. And if you feel something is being activated within you by this story, write the phrase, "Silence also speaks," so I know you understand what's behind it all. We still have much to reveal, and what comes next is even more profound. After the disappearance of the main manuscripts and the deliberate concealment of the artifacts removed from the temple, something even more enigmatic came to light. Fragments, pieces of texts supposedly saved by cult members, hidden copies, words committed to memory by those who managed to escape spiritual repression. These fragments, unlike the physical documents that disappeared, began to circulate organically among alternative scholars, spiritually curious, and even oral tradition monks who claim to recognize certain linguistic structures present there. And it is in these fragments that unsettling phrases emerge, such as, "The time of mingling is at an end," "The houses of stone will be weighed down by fire," and "The lamp of the 7 eyes will be collected before dawn." At first glance, they seem merely symbolic, perhaps poetic words. But when analyzed in light of Scripture, especially prophetic books such as Daniel, Ezekiel, Revelation, and the mysterious Book of Enoch, these phrases take on a completely different weight. They seem to carry a coded message, not just about physical events, but about spiritual cycles that govern humanity. A kind of celestial countdown, where the end of an era is not the destruction of the world itself, but the collapse of a spiritual structure that no longer upholds truth. For example, the phrase, "The time of mingling is at an end," appears in fragments with a very specific context. It is always cited alongside references to spiritual leaders who eat from the king's table and from the altar of men, a clear allusion to religious leaders who have lost their essence, mixing the word with earthly interests. This idea resonates directly with the book of Daniel, chapter 2, where the statue in Nebuchadnezzar's dream has feet of iron and clay, an unstable mixture symbolizing divided kingdoms, broken alliances, and the imminent fall of a corrupt structure. The expression, "the lamp with the 7 eyes," clearly alludes to the symbolism of Revelation. In Revelation 5:6, John describes the Lamb with 7 eyes, which represent the 7 spirits of God sent throughout the earth. In worship, this symbolism appeared frequently in ritual chants, but it was accompanied by a warning. These eyes were being progressively removed as a sign that the Spirit would be withdrawn from certain places, not by divine whim, but because faith in many would become merely performance. This raises a deeply uncomfortable point. What if the Holy Spirit is no longer present in many of the institutions that claim to be guided by him? It's precisely this kind of message that has divided scholars. Conservative theologians classify the fragments as heretical, claiming there's no doctrinal basis for these interpretations. They say they're poetic paraphrases invented by a sect. But more open-minded theologians and prophetically focused interpreters of Scripture claim they've never seen such coherent and yet bold symbolism. And that's why some have begun comparing these fragments to the writings of Enoch. In the book of Enoch, especially in the sections known as the parables, there are clear references to a generation of righteous people persecuted for seeking the truth before their time. Enoch describes celestial beings who observe the corruption of the earth and promise to reveal the mysteries sealed to the pure of heart in the last days. One of Enoch's most compelling prophecies speaks of a time of purification where altars would be washed in blood, and the voices of truth would be silenced because of their boldness. Is this or is this not exactly what happened to the cult? The parallel with Revelation is also inevitable. The expression, "end of an age," appears in the fragments, associated with the third sounding, a reference that many interpret as the third trumpet of Revelation. And when we turn to chapter 8, we see that the third trumpet speaks of a great star falling from the sky, called wormwood, which turns the waters into bitterness. Could this star represent the religious system that no longer satiates but poisons those who drink? For many spiritual scholars, yes. The repetition of these images and symbols does not appear to be accidental. The fragments speak of a letter that never reached the church, of a testimony extinguished by fire before morning, and of a name written on leaves that cannot withstand the sun. These are phrases that, in light of biblical symbolism, point to a hidden prophetic content, as if part of the revelation had been recorded and sealed, awaiting the right generation to unveil it. But what's most striking is that some scholars of Torah, Hebrew mysticism, and even Christian researchers in the field of biblical numerology claim that the fragments exhibit a cryptographic pattern. That's right, patterns of letters and numbers that, when analyzed with methods like Hebrew gematria, reveal parallel messages. One of them points to a countdown of 7 lunar cycles, which coincide with geopolitical and spiritual movements of recent years. Another directly alludes to a name, but the fragment cuts off right after the words, "The one sent will be known by the echo of the throne." What does this mean? Who would this sent one be? Are we talking about a prophetic figure who will emerge to restore what was lost? Or is it a metaphor for the collective awakening of a generation? This is still up for debate. But what no one can deny is that the fragments have shaken the foundations of faith for thousands of people. Some say we are witnessing the birth of a new spiritual reformation, not based on pastors or institutions, but on heavenly codes gradually released to those with eyes to see and ears to hear. What if this reformation is already underway, silently, like a fire that begins underground? What if these encrypted messages are actually coded prophecies, delivered to a people who failed to interpret them in the past, but who are now ready to open the seals? What if what was destroyed in the service was only the husk, and what remains are the seeds of true revelation, now scattered among attentive hearts? Do you feel that way too? The feeling that something is slowly being revealed outside the big platforms, outside the illuminated stages, outside the fame and noise? Tell me here in the comments. Do you believe that certain prophecies only make sense when their time comes? If you understand what is being said in this video, comment on the phrase, "The time of mixing is over," because this phrase is not just symbolic, it can be a spiritual marker of what is happening now, before our eyes. Below, we'll reveal even more delicate details about these messages and what they may mean for the future of faith in the world. Stay with me. It's impossible to delve into a story like this and not feel some kind of shock, whether emotional, spiritual, or even existential. When an event of this magnitude touches such profound realities and triggers so many signs connected to Scripture, we're not just talking about a strange cult or an isolated episode, but a spiritual wake-up call. A call for each person to reevaluate what they've been taught, what they've believed, and most importantly, what they've based their faith on. The impact is inevitable, because true faith doesn't thrive in comfort, but in provocation. And this kind of event has precisely this effect. It shakes people out of their spiritual slumber, their doctrinal complacency, and their ready-made formulas. It forces them to ask, do I really know who God is? Am I really listening to the right voice? Is my faith genuine or just inherited? These questions, however uncomfortable they may seem, are seeds of true revelation. But few want to plant them. What we saw after the partial revelation of the fragments, the encrypted prophecies, and the possible spiritual censorship behind the artifact's disappearance was a silent movement of re-evaluation of faith, but also an aggressive growth of denial. Many people prefer not to know. They prefer not to touch on such topics. And it's not because they're bad or false. It's because they're dangerously true, true enough to demand a change of life, of beliefs, of attitude. And that's something few are willing to face. Have you ever noticed how in churches certain topics are never touched upon? How texts like Enoch, Jubilees, or even less popular passages from Revelation itself are avoided in sermons? It's as if there's an unspoken agreement. Let's only talk about what's safe, what keeps people calm, comfortable, and within the system. But true faith, the kind of faith that transforms and liberates, doesn't hide behind comfort. It breaks structures, it challenges, it deconstructs and then rebuilds. This episode, involving the cult and intervention of the so-called divine order, is yet another chapter in a spiritual war much older and deeper than we imagine, a war between revelation and concealment. On one side, there is a continuous movement coming from the Spirit of God Himself, releasing wisdom to those who truly seek Him without fear. On the other, there is a system, often disguised as religiosity, that strives to keep everything as it is, predictable, controllable, domesticated. The real battle of faith today is not between believers and non-believers, but between those who have the courage to seek the truth and those who fear losing control of it. And it is precisely this fear that makes many prefer to mock, discredit, or simply ignore events like the one we've reported so far. They say, this is mysticism, it's exaggeration, it's fabrication. But deep down, they know that if it's true, everything changes. The pulpit changes, the discourse changes, the authority changes. Because true spiritual authority is not found in titles, plaques, or positions, but in the living revelation that burns within those who truly hear the voice of God. Those touched by this story have not emerged unscathed. Some have abandoned everything, churches, ministries, positions, because they felt they were living a doctrinal lie. Others have entered into profound crises, not because they were doubting their faith, but precisely because they were reconnecting with it in a more authentic way. It's a silent, almost imperceptible movement, but it's happening. Ordinary people who didn't consider themselves profound are reading prophecies, studying forgotten books, fasting not out of obligation, but out of spiritual hunger. There's a different breath sweeping through this generation, a call to descend to the roots and ascend to the heavens at the same time. But there's also an opposing movement, an invisible but powerful counterattack. For every awakening person, there's a multitude being lulled to sleep by spiritual distractions, empty theologies, shallow religiosity, magical formulas of blessing. It's as if the system fears losing its foundations, knowing that an awakened faith is uncontrollable. And this is the fear of those who live off the faith of others, losing control. Events like this are indeed devastating. They cause crises, imbalances, and ruptures, but they also strengthen a great deal. Because faith without crisis is faith without roots. It only grows outward, never inward. And those who, even when shaken, decide to keep digging, keep searching, keep asking, these are the true altar restorers. People who aren't afraid to face the truth, even if it hurts, even if it destroys everything built on sand. The question remains, why do so many avoid investigating stories like these? Why is there resistance when we talk about hidden manuscripts, forgotten prophecies, and supernatural interventions that don't fit into the manuals of modern faith? The answer is simple but weighty, because it demands responsibility. Knowing the truth demands change, and change hurts. It's easier to go with the flow, repeat what the pastor said, settle for a half-hour service and 3 verses taken out of context. The problem is that this doesn't sustain anyone when the real war begins, and it has already started. This war is subtle. It doesn't just happen on spiritual battlefields, but in daily decisions. What you read, what you listen to, what you question, what you swallow without thinking. It's in pulpits and in simple conversations, in topic choices, in Bible translations, in the way we ignore entire sections of Scripture because they don't fit our comfortable theology. Therefore, the faith that survives all this is not a memorized faith, but an incarnate faith, the kind that trembles before the presence, but does not shrink from the mystery, the kind that understands that not everything will be explained, but that some truths are only revealed to those who have the courage to ask what no one asks. And that's why you're here, because perhaps, even without knowing it, you're one of those who senses something is being revealed, but it's not coming in the traditional way. One of those who knows that God still speaks, but he doesn't always use the Sunday microphone. So tell me, what impact is this story having on you? Do you feel your faith being shaken, strengthened, or redefined? Write in the comments. And if you feel something inside you awakening, comment on the phrase, "My faith is returning to its roots," because you may be among those who will sustain the next phase of revelation. In the next few minutes, we'll delve even deeper into the aftermath of all this, and perhaps you'll realize this story resonates with you more than you imagined. We've reached a point in history where, more than simply absorbing what happened to that cult, destroyed by a supposed divine order, we're led to reflect, not as mere observers, but as active spiritual agents in the present. Because, however distant an event may seem in space and culture, the signs, patterns, and deceptions recur, and ignoring them would be spiritual neglect. That's why we need to look closely at every detail of this episode and extract the lessons and warnings it holds. Because they serve not only to understand the past, but to discern the present and prepare for tomorrow. The first lesson is clear. Not everything that is destroyed is evil, and not everything that is preserved is holy. This is heavy, I know, but it needs to be said. The destruction of that cult, with all its symbolism, its texts, its rituals, and its connection to profound themes of Scripture, does not prove that everything that existed there was evil. Just as the persistence of certain institutions, temples, or leaders for decades is not necessarily evidence that they are aligned with God's heart. Time, numbers, and appearances can be deceiving, but the Spirit discerns what the eye cannot see. The second lesson is even more delicate. Evil can speak as if it were God, and good is often silenced as if it were heresy. And here we enter a realm that demands pure spiritual discernment. Not everything labeled a dangerous cult actually poses a risk to faith, and not every biblical movement is, in fact, an expression of truth. Jesus warned us about this in Matthew 7:15. "Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravenous wolves." They don't come with evil looks. They come with verses, with a still voice, with authority. And that's precisely why we need to learn to discern spirits, not just words. What strikes me most about this case is how much it teaches us about mixture. The cult in question was not overtly satanic. On the contrary, it spoke of purification, mentioned God's name, referenced biblical texts, and maintained an aesthetic of reverence and spirituality. But along with this, there were distortions, manipulations, and practices that strayed from the light. And therein lies the real danger, because the most lethal deception is not that which contradicts the truth, but that which mixes with it. The devil, when he wanted to deceive Eve, didn't use a blatant lie. He asked a question, a subtle distortion, a doubt in the right tone, at the right moment. And this is how many are led astray today, by leaders who speak rightly but live crookedly, by ministries that present light but hide shadows, by messages that bring peace but nullify the cross. And this doesn't just happen in distant or strange places. It happens here, now, all around us, on social media, in viral videos, in gospel self-help books, in prayers that promise everything without demanding holiness. And if we're not spiritually sharp, we fall. That's why what happened at that service is so symbolic, because it represents what's already happening in various layers of faith today. Confusion, selective blindness. But while this episode serves as a warning, it also gives us tools. It shows us that discernment is possible, that we are not unarmed. The Bible is clear when it says in Hebrews 5:14 that solid food belongs to those who are of full age, who by reason of use have their senses trained to discern both good and evil. In other words, it's not just about knowing the verse. It's about having trained spiritual senses. And this is achieved through practice, fasting, prayer, vigilance, and exposure to God's presence. There is no spiritual discernment without intimacy with the Spirit. One of the questions that most often arises when stories like this come to light is, but how will I know if something is truly from God or if it is a well-disguised deception? The answer lies in 3 levels of spiritual analysis: the origin, the fruit, and the purpose. First, the origin. Was it born of the spirit or of the flesh? Was it revealed or forged? Second, the fruit. Does it generate repentance or just excitement? Does it bring us closer to God or merely stir emotions? Third, the purpose. Does it glorify Christ or merely exalt men, institutions, and earthly promises? Any movement, prophecy, teaching, or practice that deviates from these 3 pillars must be analyzed with extreme caution. And in this scenario, the role of the Christian is more important than ever. We can no longer be passive believers who simply consume spiritual content without filtering, without reflection, without weighing our spirit. Each of us is called to be like the Bereans, who examined the scriptures daily to see if what was preached to them was truly true. This isn't rebellion, it's spiritual responsibility. Because in times of confusion, the Christian who doesn't question can be used to spread deception without even realizing it. This story reminds us that false prophets don't wear horns or black capes. They wear suits, pulpits, and verses. They cry, they play, they teach, and yet they can be completely out of alignment with the kingdom. So don't be impressed by charisma. Don't be carried away by crowds. Seek presence. Seek the Father's voice in secret. For the days are evil and deceptions are increasingly sophisticated, but not everything is a warning. There are also lessons of hope here. The cult was destroyed, yes. The texts disappeared, yes. But something remained: thirst. The thirst that was awakened in thousands of people around the world who began to search more deeply for the truth. The thirst that overturns arguments, that breaks traditions, that makes someone wake up in the middle of the night feeling the need to pray, fast, read what they've never read before. This thirst is the sign that the Spirit is still calling. It is still separating. It is still restoring. And perhaps that's why you're here now, listening to this, because in the midst of this confused generation, there is a people being aligned, people who aren't content with crumbs of doctrine, who want the whole bread of revelation, who are tired of religious performances and are hungry for real presence. And if this whole story has touched you, it's not by chance. It's because you are among those being awakened. Now tell me, what did this story teach you? What is the strongest warning you have noticed along the way? Comment below. And if you feel God is preparing you to discern the times, write, "I don't want mixture. I want truth." In the next few minutes, we're going to delve even deeper. And if you thought you'd heard it all, get ready. What's next will shake up everything you've been taught about spiritual authority. If you've stuck with me this far, it's because this content spoke deeply to your spirit. And I want to truly thank you for sticking around until the end. It shows that you're not just anyone, but part of a generation that is awakening to deeper truths. Now, if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, now's the time. Click the red subscribe button and activate the bell, because here we'll continue to uncover topics most people prefer to hide, and you won't want to miss what's coming. I also want to ask you something. Leave a like if this video touched you, opened your mind, or ignited something in your spirit. This really helps spread this message and help more people awaken along with us. And to seal this journey, comment below the sentence, "The truth found me." Only those who made it to the end will know the weight of this phrase, and I will love to see who really walked with me this far. And of course, don't leave now. Click on the video that is appearing here on the screen because it is a direct continuation of this subject and will take you even deeper into this revelation. See you there.